Okay, having a look at biodiversity and endemism, which is on page 266 in your book, we need to have a look at what biodiversity is first of all. So we know it's sort of an important issue, a hot topic, hot button issue, and there's loads of coverage in the press and everything else about how biodiversity is decreasing, human impact on biodiversity, etc, etc. So we kind of have a bit of a background knowledge coming to this lecture on that it does matter. All right, and a general broad definition of biodiversity is that it is just the number of different species present. Okay, so the higher the biodiversity, the higher the number of different species you have. However, it's actually really hard for us to define, and biodiversity can include lots of different things. So it can range from the differences between individuals in a species, differences between populations of the same species, differences between communities, differences between ecosystems. And it can be assessed on a species level in a habitat. So how many lemurs do I have in this particular bit of jungle, to a genetic level within a population. Okay, so I've got a population of lemurs here, how genetically different are they? So it's quite wide ranging in the things that it can encompass. The Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the largest international organisation that looks at biodiversity and sort of monitors it on a global level, uses biodiversity as a term to describe the variety of life on Earth and suggests it includes genetic diversity within a species and between species. So actually defining biodiversity in terms of a scientific definition that all scientists use is really challenging. In terms of an exam situation, you can define biodiversity as the number of different species, okay, but bear in mind we can also be talking about slightly other criteria when we're talking about biodiversity. Now, as I said to you at the beginning, biodiversity is important, we know this, we understand that people are concerned about the decrease in biodiversity, but why? Why is it important and why are people concerned? So there's a few different reasons that actually when you hear about them it really makes sense. Okay, so all organisms in an ecosystem are interdependent, i.e. in an ecosystem all the organisms depend on each other, so they depend on the numbers to be stable. And organisms in an ecosystem can affect the physical conditions around them. So a rich biodiversity allows large-scale ecosystems to self-regulate and function. So what this essentially means is if you imagine a huge ecosystem, a rainforest for example, having a big biodiversity means that rainforest can be kept alive and it can regulate itself. If you didn't have a large biodiversity, say you only had 4 different types of animals in there, they might all want to eat the same type of food. One of them might be a predator of all the others. Okay, so if you don't have a wide range of biodiversity and you don't have all of those relationships linking them with each other, then you can't control the numbers and your ecosystem can't flourish. All right. Ecosystems also interlink on a global scale. So an ecosystem in a rainforest links to the ecosystem at a river, for example, across the world. So if biodiversity is reduced in one area, the natural balance can be destroyed elsewhere. So biodiversity isn't just a local thing. You can't just say, oh, this area's got low biodiversity, so it's just this particular habitat that's affected, or this particular ecosystem that's affected. They all link to each other. Air and water of the planet are purified by the actions of a wide range of organisms. So if biodiversity decreases, those organisms might not exist, so we can't have that process going on. Waste is decomposed and made non-toxic by many organisms, in particular yeast and fungi. So when we talk about biodiversity, we tend to think about, nice little animals, cute and fluffy dying, and that's sad. But actually, biodiversity of yeast and fungi, which people are less probably worried about dying off, is actually really important because of waste decomposition. And then again, plants. So people are concerned about plants. You hear about trees and the Amazon being cut down, and that is a concern. But photosynthesis by plants actually stabilises the atmosphere and the world's climate. So if you're getting rid of the plants, if you're having a fewer species of plants and fewer numbers of plants in general, then you're going to affect that balance. So as I said to you, biodiversity can mean different things to different people, and there are a few different ways that we can measure it. Okay, so if you're measuring it at the species level, you need to measure 2 things, either species richness or relative species abundance. Now, when you read the definitions, they kind of sound like the same thing, but they are slightly different. So species richness is just the number of different species in an area. So in this rainforest, there are 20 different species. In a second rainforest on the other side of the world, there are 1,000 different species. So that one has a greater species richness. And then relative species abundance is the relative number of species in an area. So that's your evenness of distribution. So what this means is there's 4 species, but there's only one example of the first species, and then 1,000 of the second, then 2, and then 7. Okay, that's not a good species abundance because there's one that's clearly dominant over the others. Whereas if your area shows an even abundance of different species, so there's, 20% is species 1, 22% is species 2, 23% is species 3, 19%, and then 21%. That shows an even abundance, so an even relative species abundance. So that area would be considered to be more biodiverse because it's not just one organism that's got control and then you've happened to find one example of another species that could be in there by chance. They're evenly distributed. When it comes to areas on the planet where there is typically the highest biodiversity, it's typically the wet tropics, which I had to Google what that means, and it tells me that it's along the equator. So those areas of the globe typically have highest biodiversity, and then as you move away from them, the species diversity generally decreases. Scientists have identified biodiversity hotspots. So this is an area with a particularly high level of biodiversity, but as luck would have it, these areas typically contain other resources like wood, gas, oil and minerals, and so there's a competition between human accessing those resources and maintaining the biodiversity. So think of your Amazon rainforest, for example, being chopped down. That's a prime example of where this conflict between the resources that human wants and maintaining biodiversity is really, really present. Another way of looking at biodiversity is to look at the number of endemic species. So this is endemism. And an endemic species is one that evolves in a geographical location and is only found in one place. So a prime example of this are kangaroos and koalas. The marsupials, they're endemic to Australia, so they're only found there. Okay, but the areas of greatest biodiversity, so the areas here, your hotspots, are not always the same as areas with the greatest number of endemic species. Okay, so Australia, for example, is not necessarily a species hotspot, but it does have a high number of endemic species. So this can cause issues if you're a scientist or someone working in government when you're trying to prioritise the conservation efforts, because what do you pick? Do you protect the highest endemic species numbers, or do you protect these biodiversity hotspots? So the last thing we need to be aware about is what determines biodiversity. So what makes it so that one area can have a high biodiversity and what means that another area doesn't. So there have been around 125 theories published to explain this, but most of these have now been eliminated because they either don't apply to all organisms, so they're obviously not a good explanation, or actually you can't support them with evidence. The best current model suggests that these biodiversity hotspots have a stable ecosystem because this allows complex relationships to develop between species. So you've got that interdependence that creates a high biodiversity. It also suggests that the areas have a high level of productivity, and what that actually means is that photosynthesis rates are very high. And it also suggests that if you want to have a high biodiversity in your area, then the organisms have to be able to grow and reproduce rapidly. Because when you've got this rapid growth and reproduction, it's more likely that mutations occur. Now, when we've been talking about DNA, etc., people always tend to think of mutations as a bad thing. But remember, it's mutations that allow us to develop advantages and adaptations. So when you've got these mutations occurring at high frequency, then it's more likely that you're going to get these adaptations which allow organisms to exploit more niches, i.e. to be able to survive in those ecosystems. Okay, so that is everything you guys need to know about biodiversity. Any questions, anything like that, please pop them in the chat and I will get back to you.